there's something on the soundtrack. There's something has this. And he said, I'm afraid, sir, that's your intake of breath when she got it right. And so I'd literally gone, she'd taken my breath away.
Telluride, which was the very first time you showed the movie in public?
Yes.
And what did that feel like?
When I was asked to go to Telluride, they said, of course, you can't tell anybody because we don't announce the films until, that week. That's part of the nature of that festival. And I said, well, I'm thrilled to be asked. To be honest, I am going to tell people because I don't think I'm going to get there. I think the COVID will defeat us and will defy us all. So I suppose I didn't. So I did tell people. First of all, I was very impressed by the size of the venue and the size of the screen, all these quite basic things that accompany the release of a film, and then how many people were there. I hadn't been in a room with that many people for 2 years, and so it was a bit overwhelming. And then to hear people listen to the film, Shakespeare always talks about hearing a play. And one of the things that I suppose as a filmmaker you become sensitive to is the quality of listening. I have been in many silences that are uncomfortable, bored silences, discomfited, and there's just a sort of faint ambient hiss of disinterest. But then you hear the pin drop stuff, and I felt that I was hearing that and also hearing an intensity of feeling that was to do with the rest of the group there being aware of being together as a community of filmgoers watching it for the first time. So it was a very charged experience.
You've done a lot of adaptations of Shakespeare.
Yes.
You've written a lot, but it hasn't been your own personal writing. You suddenly gave yourself permission. What changed?
I think lockdown invited this sort of introspection. I was very aware of the new silence. I particularly was struck by the fact that airplanes weren't in the sky, and so walking the dog. It was just, there was, I don't know, more room to think. So suddenly one's mind expanded a little, and what came in to fill the vacuum, as it were, was the sounds of Belfast, and this really this unmistakable, irresistible pull towards what I understood to be the most significant event in my life, because it had such a profound, it made for such a profound change in where I lived, who I was, how I sounded, what my identity was, and was somehow hadn't been. I had written about it before, but somehow what I hadn't re-experienced or revisited was the feeling that it had produced and that had stayed with me. That feeling of the sort of rupture from a period of settled, secure, imperfect but significant happiness into the minute, almost in a minute in your life that you start hiding.
Was it fun? Was it cathartic? Was it difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I'd written a lot of things that went into bottom drawers, so I had to some extent begun to understand that for me, writing required discipline, starting at a regular time in the morning, from my point of view, and with a determination that I must be writing something, in my case, by 9 o'clock, at 9 o'clock. If I couldn't start at 9:05. And so I had to get there early enough. Might be a lot, if I knew it was rough, I'd be in there quite early in my little shed in the garden. But I also did the primitive trick of sort of the day before knowing that I knew I knew maybe a first sentence or a first something. People ask me if I have fun making movies, and fun's never quite the right word. It can be profoundly satisfying. It can be distressing. It can be depressing. It can be exhilarating. It can be infuriating. It can be obsessive. And I suppose the writing was those things as well. But there was a sort of a a sense that there was some volition that was being unleashed. There was something was happening. It was starting to do itself a bit.
Was there inspiration on your part, if, for example, Roma?
Well, I can be absolutely honest and say that I have not seen Roma. I haven't seen Roma, and I think even back then, it wasn't so long ago, I think that I knew that I was headed towards a childhood story, and I didn't want to be influenced.
Amarcord, or...
Well, some of the classics, or even, the real classics, 400 Blows, or for me, Au revoir les enfants is a masterpiece, absolute masterpiece. That I cried from beginning to end in that film. Yes, interesting. The permission thing was a key thing actually, but also as an age thing, I think. So I'm now 60, so I guess I'm just before 60 when I started doing this. A sense that at the beginning of the lockdown, there was precious time. There was this sense that you were in a world where already you'd begun to question whether you had been taking for granted opportunities, creative experiences that you'd had that maybe you had not fully enjoyed or experienced or been present with, and so it seemed as though there was more, in a weird way, there was more at play than making a film, although it was clearly about making a film, and I wasn't going to do it unless I felt it could look outwards. It could not just be about me gazing into my navel, because I didn't think I wanted to do that. I felt as though there was recognition in the story that I'd begun to understand. I'd begun to be a little easier. I'd begun to be a little more sympathetic and compassionate towards that 9-year-old boy. And I suppose I also wanted to understand better what my parents had been going through, why that big, in a way, consider how that big change that happens in lots of people's lives as families make decisions about things that are important to them, how it affects the rest of their lives. And so you need to look back at what was that big pivotal event, and were there elements of it that people could recognize. And I began to think that there were, so that somewhere the fusion of that, the necessity to write about something personal that might reach out, seemed possible. But I think it's an interesting way of putting it. I think effectively I did give myself permission, because I thought, we don't know what's going to happen. Is this an intermission? Will we ever make films again? And I think I felt it very much in stages. I'll write the screenplay, and then we'll see what happens. Then I'll see if I move ahead, and then.
The other thing that struck me is that you've been making these very big movies, from Artemis Fowl to the Thor movies for Marvel to Cinderella, one of my favorites of yours, by the way.
Well, thank you.
All of these films are big, and they're for other people. They aren't really expressions of you.
Well, it's interesting. The Cinderella is a good example of. There was I thought, a wonderful screenplay by Chris Weitz, and then. I would say in a sort of invisible way, quite a sort of revolutionary treatment of the role of what might otherwise have been seen as a victim, where you were looking for, in a new world where Cinderella, how does that story sit, for a sort of what you might call a spiritual strength inside a situation where you might otherwise see her as having been merely abused, and ultimately having some good fortune, and yet for her to be somehow passively just a sort of at the whim of fate seemed still not necessarily a story that was necessarily one wanted to tell. And critical to sort of how you shaped that was performance. I'm talking a bit about, so what do I put into something like that? When Cinderella sees the stepmother at the end on the steps, so the prince has come and they are together and all will be well, as it were, and the stepmother is there and she's in a position to punish or apply some sort of retribution. She looks and thinks for a long time and then says, "I forgive you." And that was not in the script, and that was something that I suggested that we should say, because I thought that was the most difficult thing anybody could say, and that it was an example of a spiritual strength in Cinderella, not a sappy avoidance of conflict, but something that linked back to some spine of personal self-possession that she had throughout. And I thought that I was very glad that Chris and Disney were happy that that should go in. And I would say it's that kind of inflection that I would say was present. But yes, you're right. And I would say that happens in the family dynamics of something like in a film like Thor. But that as it applies to something much closer to one's own heart.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that you were making big Hollywood movies with a lot at stake, and this would make you more vulnerable.
Yes, and I think vulnerable is absolutely what it involved and incurred, and. So it was a very, very vulnerable moment to expose the screenplay, first off to my brother and my sister, without who. There was a lot of without whose we can't make the film. So as far as I was concerned, without their approval, there's no point in carrying on. And then we couldn't make the film if we couldn't find the boy. No point in carrying on. And then in the middle, as you make the film and you grapple with all the logistics, you are, entirely focused on that. And except for a number of, critical exceptions, the doing of it removes you from the feeling of it for a while. But then once you start putting it together, and now as you start showing it to people, actually that's where the sort of tidal wave of emotion has hit, and I have found myself very unmanned at various times when talking about the film. Partly because of understanding what some people have found in it. I mean, there was a woman, the first night in Telluride, a woman just taps me on the shoulder in the dark as the credits are rolling, and I look up, and as I look up, some of her tears hit my face, and she just started to try and speak, just like, and then eventually she got out, "I'm a grandmother," and then she just walked off. So that was all she had to say, and she had just caught Judi Dench at the end making a sort of supreme sacrifice. Jamie Dornan lost his father a little while ago, and so this was the first time he'd seen the film about a man who loses his father. A friend of mine said when they saw it the other day, they said, "Christ, you've really outed yourself, haven't you?" And I hadn't quite realized to what extent I had.
What I was curious about also was how in the change that occurred, how you eventually leave Belfast as a 9-year-old. You were, 100% in that community, and then you moved to England. I wondered, this is about you. This is about your character. This is about who you are. How did that change you?
In a way, everything that the character of Ma says on the bus to her husband about what she fears or what the difficulty will be. We're here, we know everybody, which you either like or don't like. I like it. Everybody knows the kids. They can play whatever they want. Somebody will yell from 3 streets away if something goes wrong, whatever it is, childcare. It takes a village to raise a child. We're in the village. We go over there, and she says, and we'll be on our own, and we won't talk funny, and, people there will say we're killing soldiers over here, and what I think what happened when we moved over is that the removal from that large extended family, from that village, if you like, was very, 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 very difficult. And we became a very insular unit in ourselves, and inside the unit, we all became much more isolated. And also, it was the beginning, I guess, of the, I think even then I knew intuitively, although that they had sacrificed this for us, that it was a sacrifice for them. And I think for my mother particularly, it was an absolutely sort of, in a way, a sort of catastrophic move, really. But it had to be done, had to be done, and that's not what they felt eventually. But it was very, very difficult at the time, and I think it was also for me. It was like the process of the beginning of a process of disguise. Basically, my raison d'etre then was, do not stick out. Because also you had been aware of the rapidity, the speed at which the world had turned entirely upside down. And so if it happened once, it could happen again in some other way that you could not predict. So just keep your head down. don't stick out. And but you know, so we had the economic advantage. He had the stability of the job. We had a slightly larger house, not very much bigger, really, and the much promised garden in which to play football was a postage stamp of a garden. So there wasn't much football played there. It changed things utterly. And I guess that's one of the reasons why 50 years later you're still thinking about it, because a large part of you thinks, well, what would have happened? And at the same time, you are recognizing a sort of the forging of your character then, really, with whatever you might call them, values or characteristics that remain and are more fully you than even 50 years of disguise can do anything about.
So you went in to recreate this place, and you built a set, and you had a limited budget, and you decided to shoot in black and white. Describe for me why all of those things had to happen.
Well, people say it, don't they? You know, it's all there in black and white. You know, the very phrase carries a sense that there is a greater degree of truth in black and white, paradoxical though that is. I mean, it shouldn't be, should it? Emotional truth was what we were after. I was never going to remember everything accurately or want to remember everything absolutely as it was with 50 years distance and with the determination that I look through the eyes of the 9-year-old. So I knew that it would have some kind of heightened quality. Black and white for me, whether it was that which was a huge influence watching films on television in black and white, whether they were originally color or not. That's how I saw what were often classic films with classic compositions, classic portraiture, very glamorous, presentations of females. Particularly, I think of Hollywood black and white, and I think of Barbara Stanwyck. You know, I think of that incredible glamour. And I think that as a 9-year-old, maybe like many 9-year-olds, if they're lucky enough to be in a family scenario, they often idolize their parents, you know, and they see them, or they can see them, you know, and before deciding they're full of flaws, they can see them as, very glamorous individuals. So black and white for its capacity to be both lucid, very clear, forensically clear, and so have some quality of the make-believe about it as well, of the fairy tale. That drew me intuitively to that. And I knew I wanted to put the camera where the boy might be a lot of the time, or where his view of the world might be expressed by lowering, cranes or houses, or, and I wanted to, as his innocence is taken from him, have him look through things, always be starting to hide behind banister rails, or looking through heat haze, or through window frames, and a sort of visual aesthetic, if that is the word, sort of formed out of this intuitive sense that black and white was the way to go, to give the heightened sense of his reality, this sort of, I'd call it Hollywood black and white, sort of velvety black and white. And when I'm thinking in Irish terms, I think of the liquid quality of the photography as being like sort of swimming in a Guinness or something, but shot through with these flashes of color, which were how it seemed my mind was hit by real movies in the cinema. And I think it was true that in the mid-60s, late 60s, if you were watching popular color films, they were saturated in color. They were Technicolor. Certainly, that's how I remember seeing the films you see in the film, our film, as well as others that didn't make the cut, like The Great Escape or The Sound of Music. These were epic, and the greens couldn't have been greener, and the yellows popped out, and so that was the sort of melange of influences for him. So
Judi Dench and Karen Hines, who are fabulous, as you knew they would be, and you've worked with her many times.
Yes, yeah.
He was younger than he was playing, and she was older. How did you deal with that?
For me, Judi Dench is a timeless figure, and if she's which one can't take for granted, because she is, I think, is rather rigorous. I'd call her an artistic Puritan. So if she doesn't think she's right for something, she says no. However much she may say, I say yes to everything Ken says. But so if she fancies the part, and she likes to be frightened, Judy. That's how she likes to act. She likes to act scared, go in and be in deep end, and the deep end was the accent. And we played opposite each other in All Is True, the Shakespeare film that we did, and we were husband and wife, and I didn't feel that there was an issue with that. It was the intuitive connection to the characters that I wanted from them. Kieran grew up about less than a mile away from me. He's a bit older, but he really did live around the corner, as it were. So, and he knew that kind of man. He happens to be a Catholic. I mean, I happen to be a Protestant, but for us that's immaterial. But he knew how important the differences were then. And I think Judy had much more of an Irish background than I understood. Her mum's from Dublin. She had an uncle from Belfast, and so who visited them a lot. They went back to Ireland quite a bit. And so that all started to play into something that she responded to strongly. And one of the side effects of COVID was that, people are suddenly, they're in a bubble, whether they like it or not, and a family feeling or a rapport is fairly instantly engendered. Judy has the awful trouble with her eyesight now. So when I went to see her to talk about it, she asked me to read the entire script to her, something I had never done before. Apparently people used to do it. George Bernard Shaw and Noel Coward would read their plays, all the characters. Judy said, "I'd like to know what the story is." I said, "Well, if you've got a couple of hours, I'm ready to go for it." That was when I began to understand that it would be an emotional experience, because it was a difficult thing to get through, but she was very respectful. And she was on board immediately. And was she the one who was the movie fan? I mean, she was the one who took you to the movies? She took me everywhere, actually. She things did jump. So she took us wherever I wanted to go. But we did go a lot as a family. And I went with my brother. And I think it was, I don't know, the rules are a bit looser then. But our favourite cinema was the Capitol on the Antrim Road, which you could walk across Alexander Park, which is the park in the film, and you can. We seem to be able to get in quite easily ourselves to, I remember seeing and having my mind blown by Yellow Submarine, the Beatles film. Talk about colour, and also a pretty trippy movie. I don't know that I understood it back then. I believe people had stimulants who made that film. You told me something about a shot with her where there was a glint in her eye that just astounded you. One of the things that her theatrical background equips her for is to be very lively. You don't necessarily expect big theatre types to be real naturals in cinema. I think she is, because of the theatre experience. Every take is like a rehearsal, which she would always expect to be different and to recreate, not just repeat, to explore in. So you could start her. And so, for instance, at the end of the piece, she essentially says goodbye to the family, and in a way lets them go, and understands that that is what needs to happen. I hadn't quite worked out how I should say it. I'd written half a dozen different things. We started to shoot it, and we just kept running. And Judy was able, as she always is, to improvise, which she did a bit, which you don't expect from Le Grand Dame of the British theatre, but she's ready to do that. She has really understood the virtue of stillness in movies. I mean, just literally not moving your head much and not blinking, a la Michael Caine's great advice about not blinking. But just sometimes, particularly with important moments, just giving that sort of rock-like quality. So she could do that and listen to 1,000 remarks and then come up, in this case, with her own version of these 4 lines that are this kind of breaking of her heart, but the release of the son into the new life that, given what circumstances are, means she's not going to see him much again, or indeed if ever. And when she hooked onto the signal that was that, after a good 2 or 3 minutes of doing it 50 different ways, we must have been on take 17, 18, she suddenly got it like an exercise. And you could see, it was as if suddenly she went into slow motion and the head really went like that. And then she got the phrasing absolutely perfect in the space. And I knew we'd got it. I said, cut. And I said, wow, thank you, Judy. I just wanted to absolutely triple check we've got that. And I went to the sound guys and put the things on, looked at it, and then watched it, and then said, oh, Christ, there's something on the soundtrack. There's something as this. And he said, I'm afraid, sir, that's your intake of breath, when she got it right. And so I'd literally gone, That's she'd taken my breath away, and I had unfortunately placed it on the soundtrack. We got rid of that, but we didn't get rid of her brilliance.
And you got obsessed with editing during the pandemic.
When I could, the danger of being able to go into absolutely everything. Do you know what I spent a lot of time doing was going back through the archive footage of news footage of the time. Una Ni Donila, who is our Dublin-based editor, was there, and I was in the home counties just outside London, and we, for COVID reasons, we couldn't be in the same room. So I had I had the entire project, as it were, in the Avid. For me, I was able to be much more precise, particularly about particular things to do with young Jude's performance, and that kind of forensic burrowing was super helpful, because you're always trying to capture thinking, because his performance is as much to do with how he reacts and how he contemplates and reflects, as it is about what he says. And so I was able to also marvel, frankly, at the amount of material he could give us. It wasn't like I was trying to find a needle in a haystack. There was a lot of good stuff to choose from, but it meant, I suppose, I got my hands much more around the film in a different way.
And why Van Morrison as your soundtrack?
He is from Belfast, and at that time in our lives, he had 2 years previously, in '67, he'd released, really at a quite young age, Astral Weeks, an album that was been on the high in the charts for a year or so. It was something of an urban hero for us because there were Belfast songs on there. There's a very famous song called Madam George, which was about a colourful character from the city, and he was always ear-catching because you couldn't quite work out where he was from. Because a boy from Belfast shouldn't have that soulful voice. He was influenced by American music that came via records from his father. But what I'd say is, what his music has is something that he talks about, which is his connection to the street. He calls himself, the music, he says, the music of a corner boy, one of those kids you see on the street. He has soul. He just has soul, and he has a voice that in itself is a sort of miniature orchestra, well, not miniature actually, a complete orchestra. And in my experience of working with him on this, I sensed this sort of very complete artist, someone who has been put here to make music. And actually, he felt the script spoke to him. He'd had to do a lot of traveling away from Belfast. He still lives part of the time there, but he has had this extraordinary international career. And has always gone his own way. And so in the film you get, I feel like, the heart and the soul of the city musically. And to give you an example, the song Carrick Fergus, which is a very, for the Irish, familiar air, it's a sort of not as well known and ubiquitous as Danny Boy, but Carrick Fergus is a very mournful, beautiful tune, simple tune, and been recorded by many people in many ways. But when you hear Van Morrison sing it as the father is leaving the son early in the morning, little boys waving in the window, and Van is singing about, with the chieftains, the leader of their troop passed away this very week, playing just on the harp and then some strings. It's beautiful. He takes something that others might refer to as sort of cheap music or prosaic folk music, and which it isn't, but he takes a simple tune, and when he sings, "But the sea is wide and I can't swim over," in that voice, that it gets you. It really gets you.
But it was a choice interesting to use him throughout, and there were some original songs as well.
He wrote an original song which opens the movie, and then he provides this What Score We Have, which is this sort of saxophone, electric piano led mood piece, which I think is a perfect understanding of a sort of reflective, ruminative, Celtic quality, and he responded to the film with that. There had been originally there was an experimentation with other '60s classics, but it just became clear that some of those very famous songs felt as though they'd been written for the movie. That's what it seemed like by the time you slotted them in. One other artist, Ruby Murray, who was our sort of Doris Day. Ruby Murray was a singer, late 50s, 60s, big hit artist at that time. She was from the north of Ireland. She makes it into the movie in a song that is sung through the radio, because she was also somebody we were all very proud of.
So Jamie Dornan and Katrina Baif are just amazing, beautiful, as you say, very glamorous. Perhaps we didn't know they could do what they did here. How did you know?
Even if you see Katrina in Ford versus Ferrari, I thought that there, aside from what she does in Outlander, I thought that there was a real sort of fire there, particularly in the scene with Christian Bale in the car when he has finally been dragged out of him that he's going to go back to racing. I thought she was very impressive in that. I spoke to her, and I hadn't realised she's from the south of Ireland. I knew that, but I hadn't realised she'd moved. Her father was a police officer. They'd moved to a border town when she was quite young, right on the border with the north of Ireland. So at a very frisky time. So she knew about that struggle very clearly. My own mother had definitely had a sort of, and my father, they had a sort of, I would call sort of electrical ziz between them, as to whether they liked it or not. And I felt that she just had that passionate thing. And my own mother also was very, within a limited budget, loved fashion. She loved clothes, So I thought that I sensed a depth in Katrina, a passion, and also a sense of fun. I liked her laughter. Also, in both cases with her and Jamie, for very good-looking people who can sometimes. I don't know why. Sometimes that can have been some weird kind of burden for them, and they get a bit self-involved or insecure in other weird ways. Anyway, they weren't. They feel very normal, and I like to work with people who kind of just get on with it. Jamie, I loved in The Fall TV show with Gillian Anderson, in which he's very powerful. And again, I spoke to him, and it felt like he knew the guy. He's from Belfast. And in all cases, they were going to bring something that meant that these depictions were not meant to be literal documentary accounts of my family. Again, the capacity to listen well. One of the favorite things of mine that Jamie does is when he's talking to the boy just before the funeral, and he's talking about it's a very sort of simple scene. There's not much to say, but he handles it very well. And even a couple of times the reception of bad news, the thinking is a very, it's a powerful thing to do on screen. And they both have that capacity to be present and react, and also a big wodge of feeling as well. So they delivered.
I didn't know they had karaoke back in the day.
and maybe, as I say, maybe there's a little bend of the truth there. I don't know. But what I know is that those do's. A favourite shot of mine in the film is there's a shot from the back, and in the on the table. It's in a working man's club, basically, where you clear the tables back. This kind of everything would go on in there, But there's 2 jars of pickled eggs. Which are horrible things to eat, but it would be like the catering pack version of those that would come to do like a wake, And it was partly because at least you were offering food, and because they were quite hard to eat, they wouldn't go so quickly, And as you see it as that both of them are packed, certainly there were. People sang all the time and got up and sang all. Then they put the jukebox.
I want to go back in time a little bit. I saw The Tragedy of Macbeth. Denzel, amazing in the title role, and you brought him out with Much Ado About Nothing at a time when colorblind casting was not a big, a common thing.
It was a sheer talent thing of admiring him enormously as an actor. I remember seeing him in Glory. The Ed Zwick film, and there's a scene down by a lake where he has a very simple scene with, I think it's commanding officer, and I remember thinking, gosh, I've never seen acting like that before. It's so real. It's so vulnerable. It's so open. That really impressed me. We definitely practiced color cast and gender colour blind and gender blind casting in all our theatre work prior to that, and hadn't really thought about it. And also equal pay and all these kind of things that were just seemed natural to us at that time. So I always felt in Shakespeare that this is all entirely possible as our gender swaps. I feel the creative imagination should not be limited by these things. But Denzel, I can't wait to see that.
It must have been fun not to have to act in this.
It was so consuming anyway that, and it was a delight to both watch and frankly learn a lot from Jude, but also try particularly to find the ways to make a young performer comfortable. And yes, when you have to be there much earlier to put on whatever it might be, or whatever prosthetic or this or that, and also make sure you know those lines and be focused. It's a challenge. So this time there was plenty going on. So I was very happy to be on one side of the camera.
Thank you, Sir Kenneth.
Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.